Joseph Minster didn't deserve the death penalty. After all, he was innocent. At least, that's what the evidence said. At least, that's what his lawyer said. Joe thought back to that conversation, held in a dimly lit office not much bigger than the cell where he was now confined. "You'd be a fool to take that plea bargain," the lawyer had said, seemingly full of confidence. "The only reason they're offering it is because they know this case won't stick. It's too high profile." Joe remembered how that sleaze had grinned as he gave his explanation. "You've already been hanged in the court of public opinion. The DA trumped up the charges to satisfy the mob, but they have no way to prove aggravated murder. Maybe they could get you on second degree. Manslaughter? Then you'd be in some trouble. But aggravated? First degree? No way. The guy's dead, and you did it, they've got hard evidence on that. But they've got nothing for intent." The man thought he was so slick, and he talked a good game as far as Joe could tell. He made it sound easy. Joe should have known it was too good to be true. Should have known not to trust him. What was his name? Joe realized that he couldn't remember, but supposed it didn't matter. That guy was a fraud in a cheap suit. The only thing slick about him was the grease in his hair. Joe shouldn't have listened to him. He should have gotten life in prison. They'd had his fingerprints and a witness, for God's sake. There was no way they wouldn't have convicted him. But the lawyer had kept on talking and Joe had kept on listening. "Look, we're in Illinois, not Texas. No jury here is going to approve the death penalty. A life sentence is the most the prosecution could go for, and that ain't how a plea deal is supposed to work. They're supposed to show you a stick, and offer a carrot. Or a slightly smaller stick, I suppose. Instead, they offered you the biggest stick they got, because they want to scare you enough that you won't realize they can't swing it." He'd appealed the decision, of course, and that's when someone approached him with another bargain. 1 month of work at some secret facility, and he'd be free to go. He should have gotten life in prison. This was his way out. He was still a prisoner, obviously. He still slept in a cell, still wore an orange jumpsuit, still ate the same awful food. The difference was that he knew it was temporary. Now he had hope, and that was all he needed.
There were other differences too, the nature of his work being the most obvious. Joe saw things in this place he never would have believed before, and heard about more that he never could have imagined. But there were smaller differences too. Little details, easy to overlook if you didn't care. In prison, Joe had seen all kinds of haircuts and styles. Here though, the D class all had military short buzz cuts. Another way to strip them of their individuality, he supposed, like their numbers, that stands for disposable, he'd been told on his first day, alongside a number of other new conscripts, because that's exactly what you are if you cease to cooperate. The introductory speech had been brief, but absolutely clear. Their work was important, but potentially extremely dangerous. That was why people like them were selected for certain tasks. Joe looked around the room at his fellows, some eating, some laughing, some staring sullenly at nothing. He wondered how many of them would survive their month. It doesn't matter how many of them survive. I just need to make sure I do. He remembered the end of the speech clearly. Yes, D class die. But believe it or not, we try to make sure that happens as little as possible. You're disposable, but you're not cheap, and there isn't an endless supply of qualified inmates. Just do what you're told, keep your wits about you, and you'll probably be fine. So that's what Joe did. He kept in line. For 2 weeks now, he'd done what he was told without question, and for 2 weeks, he hadn't died. A puddle of overboiled vegetables and some kind of processed meat patty were dispensed onto his tray, and he began to look for a relatively empty table. Joe didn't see much point in socializing with the other D class. None of them were here on a long-term basis, and most of them weren't really social creatures anyway. He spotted a table with only 2 occupants and turned to walk towards it. As he turned though, another man pivoted to stand up from his stool and bumped right into him. In an attempt to keep his tray from spilling, Joe stumbled through the smaller man, who promptly fell back onto his seat. Had the stool not been bolted in place, he may have fallen all the way to the floor. But it was, so he was saved from that embarrassment, at least.